Flying Edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
You're listening to the History Things podcast, a conversational approach to discussing social, industrial, maritime, music, and military history. Join us and our special guests as we dive down the rabbit holes of your favorite stories from the past. Follow the History Things podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or online at Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be sure to leave a review and a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. Pat and Parker are coming right up. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to the History Things podcast, where today we are going to be delving into one of the greatest mysteries of the modern world. I'm your host, Pat McGuire.
And I'm Parker Russell.
And today we journey into the deserts of New Mexico, to a place where the line between fact and fiction, Parker, it's blurred. Where conspiracies and cover-ups abound, to a place where in 1947, something extraordinary, something allegedly extraterrestrial, was said to have fallen from the sky.
Now, 77 years later, whether the events actually happened or not, the story has become woven into the American fabric. It has become synonymous with unidentified flying objects, extraterrestrials, murdered witnesses, and a decades-long government cover-up. It's challenged our beliefs and our trust in both ourselves and the United States government. It has inspired countless interpretations of the alleged events through film, television, stage, podcasts, documentaries, and music. In the aftermath of the Second World War and at the dawn of the Cold War and the atomic age, the world might not have known it, but it was forever changed in July of 1947. And this is a story of the Roswell incident.
It's early July 1947. The world is still recovering from the ravages of World War II, and the Cold War is beginning to cast its long atomic shadow. On the morning of the 5th, in the vast open spaces of Lincoln County, New Mexico, rancher W.W. Mac Brazel was riding across his property on the Foster Ranch after a series of fierce thunderstorms over the recent days. Riding with Brazel was William D. Proctor, the son of his neighbor. As they surveyed the land, Brazel and Proctor noticed something unusual: shiny, luminous metallic debris laying scattered across a large area of one of his fields. The confused pair would gather some of the material and head to the home of William's parents. Here, Brazel and the Proctors inspected more thoroughly the little slivers of material they had found and discovered that they could neither burn or cut or otherwise manipulate or deform the material. It was solid, but when it was crumpled up and released, the material would reform itself like a liquid on a flat surface. The Proctors went on to suggest that Brazel take it into town to show the local sheriff, George Wilcox, and to inform them of the suspected crash. The next morning, Brazel went into town and detailed to Sheriff Wilcox that following the storms and heavy rains, he set off with William Proctor for an inspection of the pastures that sprawled across his ranch when they made this strange discovery. Sprawled across one of his pastures lay debris and unidentifiable wreckage of something that had seemingly crashed into the desert at an extreme velocity. Brazel described the debris as metal and dense plastic-like beams, pieces of a lightweight material, possibly a foil, and what he thought was a type of string. The debris was thick enough in the field that Brazel's sheep refused to cross the area and were driven around it to water more than a mile away. While Brazel recounted his experience, Sheriff Wilcox didn't let on that Brazel wasn't the first to encounter strange debris or wreckage. In fact, unbeknownst to Brazel, Sheriff Wilcox had seen some of the debris before at another crash site, as well as having seen other strange and disturbing things. On the evening of July 1st, 1947, radar towers in Roswell, White Sands, and Alamogordo, New Mexico began tracking an object that seemed to defy conventional flight characteristics. Its speeds and maneuvering were exponentially far more advanced than the most cutting-edge aircraft in either civilian or military aviation at the time. The next night, as radars once again tracked seemingly the same mysterious and impossible object, at approximately 9:50 p.m., Mr. and Mrs. Dan Wilmington, who lived in the path of the radar trackings, were enjoying beverages in each other's company on their porch when they observed what Dan described as, quote, like two inverted saucers faced mouth to mouth, passing over their house at a tremendously high rate of speed. Once again, on July 3rd, radars tracked an object moving at an impossible speed through the skies of New Mexico. On the night of the 4th, 1947, as the nation celebrated Independence Day with vibrant fireworks displays, the residents of Corona, New Mexico were being inundated with violent thunderstorms. Just before 11:30 p.m., radar towers across the state of New Mexico again started picking up a speeding object in the vicinity of Corona. Corona resident William Woody and his father were watching the lightning flashes when they observed a suddenly very bright flying object speeding erratically across the sky. William described it as a flaming object, white in color, that had a red tail. Suddenly, and to their amazement, the object abruptly descended behind the mesa. At the same moment, rancher and Roswell resident Mac Brazel described hearing a tremendous explosion that stood out as unique even against the cacophony of thunder that was occurring during the storm. Likewise, recreational campers and forbidden lovers Jim Ragsdale and Trudy Truelove, who were enjoying a romantic affair at the time, saw a magnificent flash of light followed by a distinctive roaring sound and a slight tremor in the ground. Lastly, the radar tower in Roswell noted that at 11:27 p.m. the mysterious object was over Corona, New Mexico when it suddenly began to pulsate a number of times and then disappeared completely from the radar. The following morning, on July 5th, 1947, sheep herder Jason Ridgway discovered the strange wreckage of what he described as a crashed saucer. As Ridgway was processing what lay in his pasture, a group of archaeologists who were working nearby and also observed the streaking light in the sky the night before stumbled upon the crash site where, after some bewilderment and discussion, they sent someone to town to call Sheriff George Wilcox and report the downed craft. To respond, Sheriff Wilcox called the local fire department, where Crew Chief Dan Dwyer and firefighter Lee Reeves were dispatched with the station's tanker, and accompanying the sheriff and a number of deputies arrived on the scene just before dawn. The breaking light revealed twisted and burning wreckage strewn across the field. What they witnessed was something totally unexpected. It wasn't an airplane at all, but rather it was flat and egg-shaped. More disturbingly, Chief Dwyer could see three diminutive humanoid beings laying in the lee of the craft, and with his focus riveted on the craft and the strange bodies on the ground, Dwyer noticed a movement out of the corner of his eye. There, walking in front of him, seemingly from out of nowhere, was something right out of a science fiction novel. According to the fireman, it was about the size of a 10-year-old child, with grayish skin, no hair, and a large head with large eyes. According to the widow of Sheriff Wilcox, he claimed that on his initial arrival to the scene, there was a large burned area, and he saw strange luminescent metallic debris. There were four beings similar to humans, yet strikingly different. Their heads were large. They wore suits like silk, and he claimed that one of what he called the little men was still alive. The astonished firefighters and police simply stood among the ground that was tremendously torn at the impact site and tried to process what they were seeing. As they stood there, The roar of approaching vehicles grew louder when soldiers and airmen of the U.S. Army's 509th Bomb Group suddenly arrived and began to secure the area and gather up the debris. Soldiers escorted all civilians and first responders off of the wreck site and warned them of the consequences if they should ever speak of the incident. The bodies were immediately covered, and for the next 6 hours, the site was picked completely clean of wreckage and debris. Guards were posted at the perimeter to keep out the curious and unauthorized. William Moody and his father attempted to drive out toward the area where they'd seen the object come down, but found the roads to be blocked. Every road and side road on and off Highway 285 from the town of Vaughn and to the west were guarded now by military police. On site, the bodies were being transferred into lead-lined body bags. As this was occurring, John McBoyle, a reporter for the radio station KSWS Roswell, was approaching the crash site. He reported to Lydia Sleppy, a producer at KSWS's parent station in Albuquerque, that the object to him looked more like a crushed dishpan. As he attempted to move closer, Lydia recalled that an unidentified man approached McBoyle, and the two men began to briefly argue before McBoyle returned to the line and changed his story, saying that he had made a mistake in his identification. Sergeant Melvin F. Brown, who was a soldier at the impact site, was guarding the truck where the bodies allegedly were being loaded. He claims he was ordered not to look in the truck bed or body bags under any circumstances. He subsequently claims that the moment everyone's backs were turned, he did in fact open 2 of the bags and was astonished and horrified to find what he believed to be the deceased extraterrestrial crew of the crashed object. He described them as small, with large heads and small features except for striking and disturbingly large, dark, almond-shaped eyes, and with skin that was pale yellow or orange. Merely minutes after collecting himself and resuming his post, Sergeant Brown says the truck departed for nearby Roswell Army Airfield. At the same time, a man named Glenn Dennis, a mortician working at Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell, New Mexico, began receiving calls from the base mortuary officer asking if they had a stock of small, child-sized caskets and asking several questions about what various chemicals would do to blood and tissue. Dennis also claims that he was asked about procedures for preparing a body that had been exposed to the elements for a long amount of time. Later that morning, Dennis would receive an unrelated ambulance call for an airman who had been injured while he was in town. Ballard Funeral Home also operated the ambulance service for the area, and after Dennis responded to the injured airman, he transported him to Roswell Army Airfield Hospital, where he claims he just so happened to arrive at the same moment that the truck carrying the alleged extraterrestrial bodies did. At this time, Dennis says he witnessed an expeditious unloading of the body bags, which were then rushed into the emergency room where Dr. Jesse Johnson, who was the ranking doctor that morning, allegedly briefly examined the bodies and declared them to be dead. He then moved them out of sight into a different operating room. After bringing his airman to the emergency room and returning to his ambulance, Dennis claims he further witnessed strange, small, quote, canoe-like devices and unidentifiable debris with strange writing on them being offloaded from flatbed trucks in great haste. Also, while at the hospital emergency room, Dennis claims that he encountered a female colleague with whom he had known from previous interactions around the base. She had just come out of an operating room where she was struggling to breathe beneath her mask from a very powerful rotting smell inside the same room. Before Dennis could exchange greetings, she noticed him and promptly warned him to leave the facility immediately to avoid getting into serious trouble with the attending lieutenant. Confused and taken aback, Dennis says that at this moment he was approached by 2 officers who dismissed the nurse and would further not identify themselves, demanding Dennis's credentials and reasons for being on the base. He explained his role in the calls he had received, only to be shocked when the officer denied any phone calls were ever made, as well as any crash and recovery of dead bodies earlier had even occurred. One unidentified red-haired captain allegedly threatened Dennis by telling him forcefully that he did not see or hear anything, and that if he opened his mouth, they would be, quote, picking his bones out of the sand. Dennis then says he was escorted out of the building and followed back to the Ballard Funeral Home by an unmarked vehicle driven by those very same officers. Now back at Roswell Army Airfield Hospital, after alleged autopsies were performed, the bodies were said to have been sealed into long crates and taken under guard to Hangar 84, where they were then placed under 24-hour guarded surveillance. The next day, still shaken up by the encounter at the airfield hospital, Glenn Dennis claims he met again with the unnamed nurse because he was seeking answers about what was going on around town and on the base. Allegedly meeting at the officers' club, Dennis says his friend appeared unusually fearful, anxious, and even physically distressed. She barely touched her food. She discreetly showed Dennis a hand-drawn diagram of 3 bodies purportedly found at the crash site, 2 of which were described as being completely mutilated and unidentifiable, and how each of the corpses measured between 3 to 4 feet tall and bore a stronger resemblance to creatures or animals rather than displaying human characteristics. According to her drawing, the entities had large heads without teeth but with rawhide-like gums. Their faces featured 2 small holes for ears covered by lobe flaps and 2 small holes for nostrils just above the lips. The formation of the head and face bore a resemblance to what is now commonly associated with the gray alien-like beings. Also, according to the nurse's drawings and descriptions, the bodies possessed remarkably delicate hands with long fingers that lacked thumbs or fingernails, but had suction cups on the tips of each finger. Their short arms had a wrist to elbow length that was double that of the elbow to shoulder measurements. Most notably, however, their eyes were set back in their skulls. The entities were allegedly unclothed and showed no distinguishable features of age or sex. At the same time that Glenn Dennis was at the officers' club allegedly meeting with this unnamed nurse, rancher Mac Brazel was meeting with Sheriff George Wilcox and showing him the debris that had been found on his lands the day before. Sheriff Wilcox, who was still processing his own response to the initial crash site, was now being made aware of a second potential site, and without hesitation placed a call to Roswell Army Airfield to make a report. Colonel William Blanchard, also known as Bull Blanchard, commanding officer of the 509th Bomb Group, quickly ordered Major Jesse Marcel, the base's air intelligence officer, to investigate. After hanging up the phone, Sheriff Wilcox and Mac Brazel were engaged in a simple conversation when the phone would ring again. Calling this time, however, was Frank Joyce, a reporter and announcer for radio station KGFL, who would frequently call the station to ask if there was anything interesting or newsworthy going on that could be included in various news segments or broadcasts. Mystified by the morning events, Sheriff Wilcox simply handed the phone over to his friend Mac Brazel, who regaled him with the details of what he found on his ranch the day before. This is the moment that the story starts to get out locally. Major Jesse Marcel arrived at the Roswell Police Department and interviewed Mac Brazel, as well as examined the pieces of debris that Brazel had brought in with him from the ranch, and decided he needed to see the debris field for himself. They then gathered as much of the debris as he could fit into his car and returned to Roswell Army Airfield to make his report to Colonel Blanchard. Blanchard was unable to identify the materials, but was convinced that the material was of considerable significance, possibly Soviet, and as such, he contacted his superior officers at the 8th Air Force for further guidance. Acting on orders from Major General Clements McMullen, Deputy Commander of the Strategic Air Command, Blanchard directed Major Marcel to gather more of the debris. Marcel returned to the sheriff's office with the senior counterintelligence agent assigned to the base, Captain Sheridan Cavett. Together, they escorted Brazel back to the ranch with the intention of once again examining the debris field and picking up as much of the wreckage as was possible. Because of the distance to the ranch over roads that are less than adequate, Brazel, Marcel, and Cavett did not arrive until after dark. As a result, they stayed in the Hines house, which was an old ranch house close to the debris field. There they ate cold beans and waited for daylight. The next morning, Major Marcel and Captain Cavett walked the fields for some time, taking many notes. Marcel would often use a Geiger counter to measure the twisted debris for radiation. None was ever detected. The crash site at the Foster Ranch was 3/4 of a mile long and roughly 200 to 300 feet wide. A gouge running from north to south extends for 400 to 500 feet. It looks as if something had touched down and skipped along. The largest pieces of debris were recovered at the southern edge of the gouge.
There's a ghost in here.
I just saw that.
It turned off our lights.
It is our spooky episode.
This is our spooky episode.
That's right.
I'm tempted to leave that in. I think you should leave that in the editing. A ghost just came here and turned off these lights, which we fought so hard to turn on. Could it be... I'll do the Robert Stack. Perhaps you could help solve a mystery.
The debris was as thin as a newsprint, but it was incredibly strong. There was a foil-like material that when crumpled, it would unfold itself without a sign of ever having been wrinkled, almost like a liquid on a flat surface. There were what were described as I-beams that flexed slightly and had some symbols reminiscent of Egyptian hieroglyphics on them, and material resembling bakelite, which was an early form of smooth, glossy, synthetic plastic invented in the early 20th century. Major Marcel and Captain Cavett walked the perimeter of Brazel's field and then ranged out further looking for more debris, or details connecting the Foster Ranch to the other potential crash site nearby. After some time, they returned to where the bulk of the debris was located and began collecting the large pieces for transport back to Roswell Army Airfield, leaving the site just after midnight. While Marcel, Cavett, and Brazel were walking the debris fields of the Foster Ranch, 2 deputies that had been sent by Sheriff George Wilcox to search the areas between Corona and Roswell, New Mexico for further debris returned to the sheriff's office empty-handed. But they did report that they had found a field that was seemingly burned. Curiously, upon closer inspection, the deputies discovered the burn area to be in the shape of a large circle, and that the sand in the charred area had been turned into glass. Around 2 a.m. while on his way back to the base after leaving the debris field, Major Jesse Marcel stopped at his home. Excited about the strange material recovered from the Foster Ranch, Marcel awoke his wife Fayad and his son Jesse Jr. to show them the wreckage. Over the next hour, they examined the debris on their kitchen floor. Marcel Sr. is alleged to have told his family during this time that the material was likely from a crashed flying saucer. Now, for what it's worth for all of our listeners out there with security clearances, Marcel, at this point, is not breaking regulations and showing his family the material since nothing has yet to be classified. At 6 a.m., Marcel and Cavett visited with Blanchard in his quarters and informed him of what they had seen as well as what was being prepared to be sent onward to Washington. The collected debris from the Foster Ranch was taken back to the base and then sealed in crates where it was flown onto Fort Worth Army Airfield, along with debris and wreckage from the initial crash site outside of Corona. There, it was allegedly given to Colonel Thomas Dubose for further transport on to Washington, D.C. Colonel Blanchard, understanding the gravity of the situation, called the Provost Marshal and ordered him to post guards on the roads around the debris field, denying access to anyone without official military business. To this end, Bud Payne, a rancher in the Corona area, was chasing a stray cow, and in pursuit he crossed into the Foster Ranch when suddenly a jeep carrying soldiers roared over a ridgeline and chased Mr. Payne down. He was subsequently detained and taken from the Foster Ranch in a military vehicle. After this breach in the perimeter, an absolutely incensed Colonel Blanchard again ordered Mac Brazel to be located and detained and escort military police back to the crash site so they could survey again and post more guards on the thin parts of the containment perimeter. While having never been officially detained by the U.S. Army or sheriffs, Mac Brazel certainly appeared as a man whose freedom was being extremely limited, with as often as he was being questioned, sequestered, and escorting military officials around the wreck site, often seemingly involuntarily. Now, Colonel Blanchard had called the 8th Air Force earlier, and he called them again to advise them on his additional findings on the Foster Ranch. He also allegedly conveyed to them that by this time, no one on the ground was of the belief that the material was from a Soviet craft or device. This was something altogether more strange. The 8th Air Force is said to have relayed the message up the chain of command to the Strategic Air Command headquarters. At 11 a.m., Lieutenant Walter Haut had finished the official Roswell Army Airfield press release that he'd been ordered to write by Colonel Bull Blanchard. Within an hour, he'd given copies of the release to both radio stations in Roswell, as well as to both daily newspapers. The Roswell Daily Record headline the following day, on Tuesday, July 8, 1947, made a startling and historic announcement. RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. The news began to spread like wildfire. At 2:26 p.m., the story was out on the Associated Press wire.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
Immediately, the phones at the base began ringing. Calls started coming in from all over the world as the press release hit various news wires. Irritated at his inability to get a line out, or for you young ones out there, place an outgoing call, Colonel Blanchard decided to get out of the inundated office and visit the debris field for himself. While on site, he informed Major Jesse Marcel that he was being sent along with some of the additional debris and alleged bodies to Fort Worth Army Airfield to meet personally with Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commanding officer of the 8th Air Force. Several hours later, Major Jesse Marcel arrived in General Ramey's office with some of the alleged debris and presented it for the general's inspection. After several minutes, General Ramey asked Marcel to show him where the crash had occurred. Marcel accompanied General Ramey to the map room and took him through the points of interest on a map of the debris field and surrounding region. Once Ramey was satisfied, they walked back to the general's office, and to Major Jesse Marcel's astonishment and disappointment, he discovered the debris was gone, and in its place was a ripped-apart weather balloon with relative debris scattered on the floor. General Ramey informed the shocked Major Marcel that the real craft wreckage, bodies, and subsequent debris were being sent to Wright Field just outside of Dayton, Ohio, and that no one was to speak of the incident any further. Meanwhile, back in Roswell, New Mexico, KGFL reporter Frank Joyce had taken the notes he had written from his telephone interview with rancher Mac Brazel the day before and contacted Walt Whitmore Sr., the owner of the radio station. Whitmore was intrigued by Brazel's claims, and he wanted to know more. Being familiar with the area and knowing many of the ranchers out in that region personally, Walt decided to head out and meet with Mac Brazel himself. Whitmore interviewed Brazel for several hours, going over every meticulous detail of what was discovered on the Foster Ranch. He then returned to KGFL to prepare the recordings for the production of an earth-shattering news segment. While working on the segment, things in the story began to take a dark turn. Whitmore claims to have received a call from the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, with instructions passed along from the Pentagon to not air the Brazel interview. And as potential consequences for disobeying these instructions, Whitmore was allegedly informed that his broadcast license would be terminated effective immediately. A confused and shaken Whitmore cooperated. He wondered why he was being threatened like that. The Army had already issued a public release stating the recovery and possession of alleged crash flying saucer after all. Shortly after 5:30 p.m. on the evening of July 8th, Major Edwin M. Curtin was acting on orders from General Roger Ramey. He told the Dallas Morning News that the wreckage that had and was being recovered was that of a crashed weather balloon and not of a crashed flying saucer. He made no mention of the disc-shaped object and alleged bodies recovered in Corona as well. Continuing in this theme, Warrant Officer Irving Newton was ordered from the weather office at the Fort Worth Army Airfield to report directly to General Ramey's office. Newton, in front of a small number of reporters and officers of the 8th Air Force, identified the wreckage that Major Marcel had seen replacing his original wreckage on the office floor as that of a weather balloon. He was photographed with the staged balloon debris by a number of gathered news outlets and then sent back to his regular duties. At 6:17 p.m. on the 8th, the FBI sent a teletype message to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, informing him that the Army said a balloon is responsible for the reports. At 7:30 p.m., the Associated Press broke into its last message with a bulletin telling the world.
Late this afternoon, a bulletin from New Mexico suggested that the widely publicized mystery of the flying saucers may soon be solved. Army Air Force officers reported that one of the strange discs had been found and inspected sometime last week. Our correspondents in Los Angeles and Chicago have been in contact with Army officials endeavoring to obtain all possible late information. Joe Wilson reports to us now from Chicago.
The Army may be getting to the bottom of all this talk about the so-called flying saucers. As a matter of fact, the 509th Atomic Bomb Group headquarters at Roswell, New Mexico, reports that it has received one of the discs which landed on a ranch outside Roswell. The disc landed at a ranch at Corona, New Mexico, and the rancher turned it over to the Air Force. Rancher W.W. Brizzell was the man who discovered the saucer. Colonel William Blanchard of the Roswell Air Base refuses to give details of what the flying disc looks like. In Fort Worth, Texas, where the object was first sent, Brigadier General Roger Ramey says that it is being shipped by air to the AAF Research Center at Wright Field, Ohio. A few moments ago, I talked to officials at Wright Field, and they declared that they expect the so-called flying saucer to be delivered there, but that it hasn't arrived as yet. In the meantime, General Ramey describes the object as being of flimsy construction, almost like a box type. He says that it was so battered that he was unable to determine whether it had a disc form, and he does not indicate its size. Ramey says that so far as can be determined, no one saw the object in the air, and he describes it as being made of some sort of tinfoil. Other Army officials say that further information indicates that the object had a diameter of about 20 to 25 feet, and that nothing in the apparent construction indicated any capacity for speed, and that there was no evidence of a power plant. The disc also appeared too flimsy to carry a man. Now, back to Taylor Grant in New York.
General Ramey also appeared on Fort Worth, Dallas radio station WBAP to announce that the officers at Roswell Army Airfield had been fooled by a weather balloon. You can see where we're already at.
Right.
All right.
That happened quick.
At 10 p.m., ABC News Headline Edition tells the audience that Roger Ramey has identified the Roswell wreckage as a weather balloon. And then by midnight on July 8th, 1947, it seemed that the Army had nicely placed a lid on the events that allegedly occurred on July 4th and 5th in the skies and deserts of New Mexico. Morning newspapers on July 9th, 1947, trumpeted the news story that, quote, the flying saucer found near Roswell was merely a weather device. Some news outlets directly quote General Ramey, while others quote informed sources, including senators in Washington. Cleanup on the various sites resumed at sunup, with the military trying to get everything picked up before any more civilians stumbled across the strange debris field. And now, with the weather balloon story being firmly put in place, rumors and eyewitness accounts begin to spread like wildfire, and the public is left with more questions than answers.
Tune in Monday, November 3rd for the conclusion of UFO crash at Roswell.